Good day, Grinder School. This is Nodeg. We're in part 4 of the How to Master Heads-Up Sit and Goes, and this is the first of 2 videos I'm doing on adaptive strategy, where we're going to talk about various things you can do to adapt to your opponent, which is pretty much the essential principle behind heads-up sit and goes, or really all poker, when you're starting to get to opponent-specific adaptions. So obviously, when you're playing against only one other player, it's really important to try to find and exploit their weaknesses as best as possible. So to start out with, we are going to talk about 3-betting. I mentioned earlier that in general, realists, we aren't going to really have a 3-bet bluffing range when we're deep. So we're going to talk about situations where we might decide to add those and what types of hands we're going to use to bluff with, as well as things to avoid. So getting into our normal 3-bet range, right? This isn't our normal 3-bet range, but or correction, this is our 3-bet range. Our value 3-bet range is going to be 9s plus, and this is 75 big blinds deep, right? So all these cards that aren't highlights, right? So our normal opening range is this yellow range here, and the range in the middle, which has all the high pairs and all the face cards that aren't highlight yellow. That's our normal 3-bet value range. And there's really no need to expand this read list when you're deep, just because there's no reason to lower the SPR unless there's a profitable reason to do it. And for the most part, a lot of people are fit or fold at low stakes, but even at high stakes, there's no reason to really spaz until you have a feel for your opponent. So again, like I've already stated, there's no need to adapt a 3-bet bluff range deep, but it is, of course, definitely profitable to 3-bet bluff versus certain villains. So 3-bet bluff hand rankings in general, junky high cards, I'd also include in with the junky high card range. Usually they get combined because junky high cards tend to be at the bottom of our calling range. So we could also add a lot of these second category here, small connectors, into that range as well, the bottom of our calling range. But in general, we're keeping them separate here for a reason. You might notice that the connectors I talk about here aren't particularly good ones, and that's just because a hand like 8-9 suited has a lot of value seeing a flop with. So in general, we're not going to be 3-bet bluffing with hands like that. And then there's after the small connectors, suited or not suited, although obviously the suited range is going to be preferred in most cases just because of the extra bit of post-flop equity that we might have from that. The final category is crap, which is really hands that we would normally not even be calling with. This range in general isn't really a good 3-bet bluff range, but I'm going to kind of talk about each of these ranges or regions why you might include these ranges, starting with the crap range. So against this villain, this theoretical villain that we're playing against, that we decide to open up a 3-bet bluff range in, we're deciding to put in a bunch of crap. As you can see, I have pretty much every suited card here that we're not just flatting with, and a bunch of the offsuit ones too. And we could widen that to really any 2 cards that we normally wouldn't even call with against a villain like this. And this particular villain, he folds to a majority of 3-bets, around 90%, and he folds a lot and post-flop, and he either plays fit or fold on the flop or with a very predictable range, or he 4-bets the majority of the time. So in other words, he folds 90% of the time approximately, and 4-bets you the rest of the time, which makes it even better to play with hands like this. Just because you're never going to see a flop anyway, so there's no need for you to have equity. Now against this villain, you may notice that my value 3-bet range has contracted slightly, just because the guy folds so much, and it's worthwhile generally to actually see a flop with a couple of the lesser hands in that 3-betting range. So we're essentially increasing our bluffing range. We're making our bluffing range consist entirely of hands that we normally would fold against the average villain. And in addition to that, we're seeing a flop with a good deal of our range. And the reason why we're seeing a flop is simply because in general, somebody that's this weak tight will often, even out of position, be very profitable to play against. So there's no need to add a bluff range in that's in hands that aren't within our normal call range super deep. One thing to note about this range, of the bluff range, is that you don't necessarily have to 3-bet with it every time, but you can choose to from time to time. The less the villain adapts to you 3-betting the more often you can throw in those junk hands there. But we still want to 3-bet with our value hands somewhat. Obviously with kings or aces we can try playing a bit tricky, but a player like this, it might not even be worth it post flop, depending on how deep you are. Obviously as you get more shallow, aces and kings, you'd be flatting just because of the potential to get more out, especially since he is folding to such a wide variety of 3-bets. Another important thing about a villain that's this tight is we can actually make our 3-bets a little bit smaller a lot of the time, just because they're folding so much. If they start adapting and calling more, well, we can do one of two things. We can either start increasing the strength of our 3-betting range to more value oriented, or we could quite simply just go back to a regular 3-bet size. It's really important when adapting a 3-bet strategy, when you are lucky enough to come against a villain like this, to keep in mind that there will be adjustments, particularly when stack size shrinks. So be careful not to overdo it. And also, as you get shallower, obviously your 3-bets are going to have to be a little bit smaller, and or bigger, depending on how low you're talking. So you might start 3-bet jamming. When you get down below 20 big blinds, in general, you're not going to be using this bluff range anymore. You're going to start jamming with the lower end of your calling range. So hands like King 2, stuff like that, simply because they're tight and it's profitable to do it. Plus, they have a blocker. That being said, at that point, you can also start adding. Suited connectors, higher end suited connectors into your jamming range, simply because they're folding so much. But again, like I said, even in an early game, somebody might have these kind of tendencies, but as they get down to short stack, they might become more aggressive. So again, just don't make any assumptions that their ranges aren't fluctuating as you play, and just try to pay attention to that and take a lot of notes. And I guess it probably goes without saying, but I'll mention it anyway. When you're making this kind of drastic 3-bet adjustment, you need a few hands. Like, you don't need thousands of hands, but you should have played a few matches and have at least been in more than 1 or 2 3-bet situations. The more the merrier, obviously. Like, if you played thousands of games, or hundreds of games, or even like 50 or 60 games against an opponent, which will be rare at the micro stakes, and this 3-bet range is closer to 80 or 70, or maybe even 65, depending on the villain. You can still adapt the strategy against them sometimes, but again, it all comes down to these post-flop reads. Essentially, the reason why you're inserting these junk hands is because you're almost never seeing a flop. So and it's so rare for you to see a flop that there's no reason for you not to totally exploit that by throwing in cards that would normally be just an easy toss away. Now moving on to a second type, this villain, he has a tendency to call, right? So he's going to call a majority of our 3-bets, so greater than 50%, and he has a tendency to probably call a lot of C-bets post-flop. So in general, I still don't like the idea of three betting with suited connectors, larger suited connectors against this type of villain, simply because they have too much value playing with a higher stack to pot ratio. And the reason behind that is you'll often have very good draws for these post flops, so you want to have a little bit of room to try and push the villain around with your draws, and also have the odds to perhaps call C bets in some cases. So when you're deep, you definitely don't want to be jamming cards like that. In my opinion, there's way too much value. These lower suited connectors, though, and even these higher non-suited connectors, are a pretty good range just to toss in. Because he's calling a lot of three bets, we can actually increase our value range as well, which you see above here. So basically, our game plan when we do see a flop is we hope that we're a lot of the times we're going to be dominating. So we're definitely going to be putting in a C bet whenever we hit. But even when we don't hit, a lot of the times we will have a lot of scenarios where we can bluff and semi-bluff, simply because when he calls so wide, you can rep pretty much any high card board, and on top of that, the amount of straight draws and backdoor equity that you'll get when you get called with these cards could be good enough. But you definitely one important thing for any three bet scenario, pretty much in any form of poker, from what I've experienced, but in three bet pots in general, you don't want to be playing very straightforward. So a lot of the times you're going to be playing your draws pretty hard in a three bet pot as an example, especially as the stack to pot ratio lowers. So just keep that in mind, that against a villain like this, who's possibly a total calling station, you might have to be prepared to fire three barrels and get your money in on the river. But at the same time, against a really wicked calling station that's going to call you down with absolutely, with middle pair or bottom pair, even if you stuff the pot on a wet board that he barely touches, then it's not necessarily the best strategy to try barreling them off. So you have to be aware of their tendencies there as well. But the good news about a player like this that's going to be calling a lot of three bets is if he hits a top pair, he is definitely going to go down to the felt. So those times when you hit and you both hit top pair, your range is significantly stronger than his, and the odds are you have him significantly dominated. So that's going to make you a ton of money. So even though we're talking mostly about three bet bluff ranges, though, we definitely have to add value against the player that's going to be calling really wide, simply because we'll definitely pull a lot of value out of here. And this is another type of player that you can lower the size of your three bets, because you know you're going to get called a lot, and by lowering the size of your three bets, you make it so that you aren't necessarily as committed to your hand, but at the same time, because of his tendency to call on the flop, you have the ability to still control the pot and stuff it and get a lot of value. So yeah, so you can reduce your three bet size to 2.5 or maybe even a 2.25, depending on the stack sizes. And you're really, against this kind of villain, you're counting on making profit from being able to barrel them off, or to be able to hit any of your significant draws, or just having the better hand. So there's going to be a lot of c-betting, but anytime we c-bet, we're still going to have to fire again. And due to their weak range, we can really take advantage of high card boards, etc. So the final range we're going to look at is a reg-ish sort of range. So this villain's going to be folding a fair amount of three bets. They're also going to be opening really wide, anywhere between 70 to 90% of their hands. So they're going to be calling with very strong range in general, but they're going to be folding a fair amount too. So we're going to be using the bottom of our calling range as our three bet range. And essentially this turns hands like, say, 8-7 offsuit, which the only reason why we're calling with is because calling is marginally better than folding, and we're trying to make them profitable by taking advantage of our villain's loose betting range. And also, all of these hands have a potential to hit the board in a situation that will allow us to continue. This is probably the most significant 3-betting range that we'll use overall, and that's because as we become shorter stacked, this will become our default 3-betting range regardless of the opponent that we're against. Within reason anyway. Obviously, against somebody that's tighter, we're just not going to be 3-betting at all, as a bluff anyway. So this will actually become a bit of a 3-bet jam range against as we get really, really low. As a bluff against players that we feel that will be effective against. So in general, even though we might start including these as our 3-bet bluff range when we're lower stacked, obviously our value range is going to change a bit too, and it will expand or contract depending on the situation and whether or not it's more profitable to play post flop or not. So, and we'll discuss this to a degree as we get into the short stack videos. But for example, a hand like King 10 suited, we probably wouldn't be 3-betting when we're at around 25 big blinds. But as we get lower, 3-bet jamming it at 14 big blinds, say, is definitely an okay value jamming range against the villain that's opening at a correct frequency, say over 60%. So even though this the idea of betting the bottom of our calling range is still there, we're not going to expand our value range beyond what would normally be done at those stack depths. And one other important thing about this 3-betting range is that the main reason why we're not including these middle hands here, like Jack 7 suited, Jack 8 suited, is we don't want to overplay them. Against villains like this, in general, they'll be folding a lot of hands that these ranges do well against, and also even their value range that they would be calling a 3-bet or jamming over. These hands do fairly well even out of position. So we're not going to be adverse to seeing a flop with them, and we don't want to overplay them at all. And there are certain benefits, like we saw with the Type 2 reg, of using suited connectors in our 3-betting range. But in general, when our villain is expected to fold a great deal, we lose a lot of that advantage. So, and also, of course, as the stack depths go lower, those advantages also start dropping quite a bit, since speculative hands aren't as valuable even out of position, or especially out of position, I should say. Alright, so now moving on to check raising. Oops. Again, our default check range is going to be entirely for value. That being said, of course, on very dry boards, king high boards, for example, king hearts, 6 spades, 3 clubs, it can be very tempting as well as profitable to check raise. But an important thing to ask yourself whenever you do this is, what does the villain have when they flat? Versus a villain that's only going to flat with 6 or a king, you can definitely put yourself in a situation where you give up a little bit more, perhaps only continuing if you gain equity. However, if you're versus a villain that's going to float with, say, Jack 9 here, say Jack 9 of hearts, or Queen 10 of hearts, just to pick something random with a backdoor flush draw and 2 overcards to the 6. Pardon me. It could be definitely profitable still to check raise, but you have to keep in mind that the wider a villain's calling range is on a board like this, the more you're going to have to barrel, sometimes with little or no equity. So you should always keep that in mind when you're going to start check raising. You have to know that it's profitable to barrel somebody, feel pretty confident with it. If you're going to play really straightforward after the flop, and you're going to just give up on the turn or river, versus somebody who's going to be floating you wide on this board, then you probably should not be check raising here. Now, I mentioned here that if you have a hand that's like a decent middle pair, or any middle pair really, you could consider check raising versus an aggressive barreling player. And the reason is that a pair of sixes on a king high board, there's very few turn cards or river cards that don't scare your sixes, and you're going to have to give up an awful lot. And so versus a very aggressive barreling player, it's sometimes more profitable to turn your hand into a semi-bluff by check raising. And of course, like any semi-bluff, we have the advantage of potentially picking up equity on the turn or river, which would allow us to continue being aggressive here. Another point about check raising, in general, our check raise size will be larger with draws, and as well as weaker holdings on wet boards. That being said, of course on dry boards, both our value and our bluffing bets are going to be a little bit smaller than normal. When check raising, we have to be constantly aware of SPR and what our odds are versus the villain's range. And in general, when you get into spots where you're unsure if your fold was correct, if you get re-jammed on after you check raise, you should probably do the math. So I have a couple of hands, well, the same hand twice that I went over here. So in this first example, we have 10-5 of diamonds. We're exactly 25 big blinds deep, so our stacks are 1500 chips here. The small blinds betting 2x, so 120 chips, and we decide to flat. So the pot is 240 chips, and the flop is jack diamonds, 10 clubs, 4 diamonds, giving us a middle pair and a flush draw. We decide to check, and the small blind bets 120 chips. We raise to 300 chips, and the villain jams. So based on the amount of money that we've already put into the pot, and the amount that we have to call, obviously, for EV calculations here, the pot odds that we are getting right now is 36%, and versus a purely top pair range, so basically every jack X hand you could possibly have, we're 46%. I'd say even against a pretty good, like if you were to throw in better draws and a bunch of other stuff here, we're at least 40%, so we can't fold here. And in fact, we probably should have check raise jammed to increase our fold equity right off the get-go, 25 big blinds deep. So if you're ever in a situation like this and you fold, it's definitely a huge mistake. So now we're going to go to another example, which is basically the same hand, except in this case we are 75 big blinds deep. Again, 1500 chip stacks. So in this particular case, the small blind bet 60 chips when we flat, and the pot's 120 chips. The flop again comes jack 10-4, 2 suited. So we have again middle pair and a flush draw. We check, villain bets 80 chips, and we decide to raise to 240 chips, and the villain jams. So our pot odds aren't quite as clear this time. We're getting about 40%, 1.5 to 1. I plugged this in with just pure value range here, and we're still 45%. So actually, obviously we can't assume that there's a pure value range here all the time. Although it tends to lean more that way at these depths. So here it's actually kind of a hard fold. And a lot of that just comes to how the hand played out. Like obviously there's a 3x open there that we flatted, but probably more importantly is that we decided to raise up 3x, which does make a bit of a difference. I think that there are enough stronger draws than ours that might be in this situation occasionally to make this a little bit more marginal, like a potential fold. You can talk yourself into it, but at the same time it's kind of a gross spot. So in general, you might not necessarily want to be check raising a board here that's this wet, just because of the strong ranges that you might be up against. Obviously, if the villain's going to be spewing at you with a wider range on a wet board like this, then it's to our benefit. But with a hand like middle pair, with an okay flush draw, we might not want to push that far. But there are a lot of spots where you will raise up somebody and they'll jam you, and you'll just have to call because of pot odds. And so it's always something to keep in mind, and you should always do a lot of equity checks throughout your play. You might be looking at this and question exactly any other tactics you can use if a check raise fold here is kind of bad. Well, I mean, you can always consider donking out on the flop, and you can also consider just check calling if you're getting a good price. So it's definitely worth keeping in mind, especially if the villain's representing a strong range. Of course, the odds of getting jammed 75 big blinds deep here are fairly low, and because of that, you know, you might be able to find a bit of a crying fold. But obviously you have to weigh this all on the villain's aggression and how they play in general. And I would certainly fold in this scenario, although I'd be cursing it a bit, and that's simply because the reason why I could justify that would be that the amount of times that I thought a villain that was playing a really strong range here is going to fold would make up for the value that I lose, that 5%, for the times that he jams over. But at the same time, you're definitely losing money in these kind of spots. So especially the wider the amount is. So obviously short stacked, the decision gets easier. You take your equity and you just go with it. 75 big blinds, you can come up with a hero fold here. But the lower the stack to pot ratio gets, just the more wrong that is. So you don't want to inflate a pot and then fold when you have the odds to call. That's basically my summary of all that. So what this really illustrates is that there's kind of a phenomenon, like a lot of places where it would be very profitable pre-flop to 3-bet, and a lot of strategies that are based around, you know, beating around nits by 3-betting them free. Taking that same kind of mindset into check raising on the flop can often backfire pretty hard, because a check raise on the flop in a regular open pot can often lower the SPR to a point where you're pretty much obligated to call any jam. So in general, this is one of the reasons, if you're going to avoid one thing, check raising or 3-betting light, check raising would definitely be something I'd be a bit conservative with. We can offset this bit by doing min check raises on really dry boards from time to time against certain villains. We can actually do it both for bluff and as value. It's amazing how often some players will spew at you if you do a min check raise. But in general, we are certainly going to be only check raising for value. Obviously, as SPRs get lower, like that first example that I gave you here, this is a pretty standard shove in this spot, just because you have so much equity against most people's ranges here, and you want to maximize the fold equity, so you're just going to jam here to try to maximize the profit you make from this hand. So even deeper, like this is 75 big blinds deep. It's sometimes shocking, you know, that even versus an entirely value range, when you check raise with your semi bluff here, you're really close to being obligated to call, even versus a strong range. So always keep that in mind when doing check raises for sure. It's really easy to spew off your tournament odds by getting too check raise happy, particularly when you're deep, or as deep as 75 big blinds anyway. The deeper you get, the less relevant the SPR becomes, of course. So Now that I've talked about the two most common aggressive adjustments against players, the next video I'm going to start talking about typical player traits, archetypes, and exactly how we adjust to them, and what one tendency might tell us about other tendencies that a villain may have. So I hope you guys are enjoying the series so far, and I'm going to have one short before the continuation of this video in between, talking about some more situations. So for now, I'm going to cut this video. Please feel free to leave any questions in the forum. Thanks.